Hi, I'm Ruth and I need to tell you about the day my world turned upside down. I was 71 years old sitting in my kitchen when I heard my grandson Kelvin say something that broke my heart. I hope she dies before the wedding so I don't have to deal with her anymore. Then I'd get the inheritance too and could plan the wedding I actually want. Those were the words that changed everything. Words spoken by my own grandson about me. Words I was never supposed to hear. I was sitting in my kitchen on a quiet Tuesday afternoon going through the final wedding bills for Kelvin's dream wedding when I heard his voice drifting from the living room. He was on the phone with someone and his tone was casual, relaxed. He had no idea I was there. "I can't wait until this wedding is over," he had started, and I paused, my pen hovering over the vendor invoices spread across my kitchen table. "Grandma keeps trying to give her opinions about everything. So embarrassing. My friends keep asking why she's so involved in planning my wedding." My heart started to sink. But I told myself he was just stressed. Wedding planning could be overwhelming, especially for a 24-year-old. I kept listening, hoping he'd say something kinder. "I wish she'd just pay for it and stay out of it," he continued. And I felt like someone had slapped me. Here I was looking at $100,000 worth of contracts, all signed in my name, all my responsibility, and he saw me as nothing more than a nuisance who happened to have a checkbook. But then came those devastating words that I opened with. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at those vendor contracts scattered across my kitchen table. Every single one bore my signature. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the photography, the music, all in my name, all my choice. Then I heard him laugh. A sound that used to bring me such joy. "I know it sounds awful, but she's got to have at least $1 million saved up. If she died now, I'd get that money, plus not have to deal with her interfering anymore." I quietly stood up, walked to my home office, and pulled out my business filing cabinet. 20 years of running a restaurant had taught me to read contracts carefully. As I flipped through the wedding agreements, I realized something that Kelvin had never bothered to understand. I wasn't just the grandmother paying for this wedding. I was the primary client on every single contract. I picked up my phone and smiled for the first time in weeks. It was time to make some calls that would change everything. But let me start from the beginning so you understand exactly how someone I loved more than life itself could wish for my death while I was spending my life savings on his happiness. Because what happened next wasn't about revenge. It was about respect, dignity, and learning that even at 71 years old, I still had more power than anyone realized. Before we continue, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories like mine. My name is Ruth Richardson. I am 71 years old and I live in Springfield, Missouri. I've been a widow for 3 years now, ever since my husband Harold passed away from a heart attack. Harold was a good man who worked hard his whole life. And when he died, he left me well provided for with life insurance, our savings, and our house that's been paid off for over a decade. Kelvin is my son, Michael's son, my only grandson, and honestly, he's always been the light of my life. He's 24 years old, works as a marketing coordinator at a local company, and got engaged to his girlfriend Brenda last year. When he called me crying with joy about the proposal, I was so happy for him. Now, I should tell you something about myself that becomes important later. Before I retired, I owned and operated a family restaurant called Ruth's Kitchen for 20 years. I learned how to manage vendors, read contracts, handle business relationships, and deal with all kinds of people. I wasn't just some sweet old grandmother who didn't understand how the world worked. I knew business. When Kelvin got engaged, he and Brenda started planning what they called a small, intimate wedding. They had saved about $5,000, which would have gotten them a nice ceremony at the local community center with maybe 50 guests. But Kelvin kept talking about this dream wedding he'd seen in magazines with beautiful flowers and an elegant venue. One evening, he was at my house for dinner, flipping through bridal magazines and sighing. "I wish we could afford something like this," he said, showing me pictures of elaborate receptions. "But I guess we'll just have to make do with what we have." That's when I made the decision that I thought would bring us closer together. "Sweetheart," I said, "what if Grandma helped make your dream wedding come true?" The look on his face was pure joy. He hugged me so tight and called me the best grandmother in the world. We spent the next month planning together. Kelvin's dream wedding would cost $100,000. I know that sounds like a lot, but I could afford it. Between Harold's life insurance, our savings, and what I'd put away from the restaurant, I had the money to give him this gift. I put down $15,000 in deposits and signed all the vendor contracts as the primary client. The beautiful country club venue, the elegant catering with a 5-course dinner, the professional photographer, the florist who would create stunning arrangements, even the string quartet for the ceremony. The remaining $85,000 in final payments would be due 30 days before the wedding. My son Michael and his wife Karen seemed so grateful. They kept thanking me and saying how generous I was being. Karen even said, "Ruth, you're making dreams come true for our family." I felt so proud to be able to do this for them. The wedding was scheduled for 6 weeks away. Everything was planned perfectly. All the deposits were paid, and I was so excited to see Kelvin walk down the aisle in his beautiful suit. I thought I was giving him the most wonderful gift a grandmother could give. I never imagined that he would see my generosity as interference, or that he would wish I wasn't around to see the wedding I was paying for. But I was about to learn some very painful truths about how my own family really saw me. About 2 months into the wedding planning, I started noticing subtle changes in how Kelvin treated me. It began with small things that I tried to brush off, telling myself he was just stressed about the wedding. The first real incident happened during a meeting with the florist. I had suggested adding some white roses to the arrangements because they had been my wedding flowers, and I thought it would be a sweet way to connect our generations. Kelvin's face immediately soured. "Grandma, that's so old-fashioned," he said, rolling his eyes right in front of the florist. "We're going for a more modern, elegant look. White roses are what people used in the 1950s. I felt embarrassed and hurt, but I told myself he was just being a perfectionist about his special day. The florist looked uncomfortable and I quickly said, "Of course, dear. It's your wedding." But the dismissive attitude continued. Every suggestion I made was met with, "That's not the vibe we're going for," or "My friends would think that's weird." When I mentioned that many of my friends were excited to attend, Kelvin frowned and said, "We need to keep the guest count manageable, Grandma. Your friends won't really fit in with our crowd." I was paying for everything, but apparently my opinions, my friends, and my feelings didn't matter at all. The worst part was how he started excluding me from important decisions. One afternoon, he had scheduled a cake tasting with the baker. And when I arrived at the bakery, I found out the appointment had been moved to earlier in the day without anyone telling me. "Oh, didn't I mention it?" Kelvin said when I called him. "We had to change the time, and I figured you didn't need to be there for every little detail." But this wasn't a little detail. This was a $1,500 cake that I was purchasing, and I wasn't even invited to help choose it. Kelvin began scheduling vendor meetings without me, making decisions about thousands of dollars I was spending and treating me like I was some interfering busybody instead of the person making his dream wedding possible. The breaking point came when I discovered he had completely changed the guest list. I found out when one of my dearest friends, Ruth, called to ask if she'd done something wrong because she never received an invitation. "Ruth, what do you mean?" I asked, confused. "Of course you're invited. I gave Kelvin your address weeks ago." That's when I learned that Kelvin had removed not just Ruth but 6 of my closest friends from the guest list. When I confronted him about it, he shrugged and said, "We needed to make cuts somewhere. And honestly, your friends won't really understand the type of wedding we're having." I felt like I'd been slapped. These were women who had been my friends for decades, who had supported me through Harold's death, who had been excited to celebrate with me. But according to Kelvin, they weren't good enough for his expensive wedding. "Kelvin, these are important people in my life," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "If I'm paying for this wedding, I should be able to invite my friends." "Grandma, you're being dramatic," he replied. "It's not about you. It's about Brenda and me having the perfect day we want." I started noticing other things too. When Kelvin's friends came over while we were planning, he would get visibly uncomfortable if they asked about my involvement. Once I overheard him tell a friend, Yeah, my grandmother is really into this wedding planning stuff. She has opinions about everything. The tone made it clear that my involvement was something to be embarrassed about, not grateful for. Another time, I suggested that we include a memory table with photos of family members who had passed away, including Harold. Kelvin immediately said, "That's so depressing. We want people to be happy, not thinking about dead people." I felt like I was being treated as a burden rather than a beloved grandmother. Every interaction became about managing my interference instead of celebrating together. I was good enough to pay for everything, but not good enough to have any say in what I was buying. The pattern was clear. Kelvin wanted my money, but he didn't want me. He saw me as an obstacle to his perfect day, not as the person who was making it possible. And sadly, Michael and Karen never stepped in to defend me or correct Kelvin's behavior. They seemed to think that as long as I was willing to pay, I should just accept whatever treatment I received. I started dreading our planning sessions instead of looking forward to them. What should have been a joyful time of bonding with my grandson had become a series of rejections and dismissals. But I kept telling myself that once the wedding was over, things would go back to normal. I had no idea how much worse things were about to get. 4 weeks before the wedding, I was supposed to meet Kelvin at his apartment to finalize the wedding favor choices. He had asked me to come by at 2 p.m. to go over the samples together and make the final decision. These were small silver picture frames that would cost about $8 each for the 150 guests. I arrived at his apartment building around 1:45 p.m. wanting to be on time. Kelvin had given me a key to his place last winter when he had pneumonia and needed someone to check on him and bring him soup. I'd kept the key because he said it made him feel safer knowing I could get in if there was an emergency. As I walked up to his apartment door, I could hear Kelvin's voice through the thin walls. He was clearly on the phone with someone, speaking in his normal tone, not whispering. I realized he had no idea I was there early. I quietly unlocked the door and stepped inside, planning to wait in the kitchen until he finished his call so I wouldn't interrupt. But as I stood there, I couldn't help but hear what he was saying. "Sarah, I'm so exhausted from all this wedding planning," Kelvin was saying to his maid of honor. "And the worst part is dealing with my grandmother." Froze. He was talking about me. "She keeps trying to give her opinions about everything," Kelvin continued. "The flowers, the music, the guest list, even the wedding favors. So embarrassing. She has these old-fashioned ideas about what a wedding should be like." My heart started to pound. I knew I should leave, but I couldn't move. I needed to hear what he really thought about me. "My friends keep asking why she's so involved in everything," Kelvin said. And I could hear the frustration in his voice. "They think it's weird that someone her age is so into planning a young person's wedding. Like, doesn't she have her own life?" Sarah must have said something because Kelvin laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was mean. "Exactly," Kelvin said. "I keep trying to hint that she should back off, but she doesn't get it. She thinks because she's paying for everything, she gets to have opinions about every little detail." I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. Here I was spending my life savings to give him the wedding of his dreams, and he saw me as nothing more than an embarrassing burden. But it got worse. "I wish she would just write the check and disappear," Kelvin said. And his voice was getting more animated, like he was warming up to complaining. "She's ruining my perfect day with her constant input. This is supposed to be about me and Brenda, not about making my grandmother feel included." I gripped the kitchen counter, feeling dizzy. After all the planning sessions, all the excitement I thought we'd shared, all the times he'd hugged me and thanked me, this was how he really felt. "You know what the worst part is," Kelvin continued. "She acts like she's doing me this huge favor, but honestly, she's probably just lonely and desperate for attention. Like, get a hobby, you know." Sarah must have made some comment because Kelvin laughed again and then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Sometimes I think about what it would be like if she just wasn't around anymore," Kelvin said casually, as if he were talking about the weather. "Like if she died tomorrow, I wouldn't have to deal with all her opinions and interference." I couldn't breathe. My own grandson was talking about my death like it would be convenient for him. But he wasn't done. Actually, that would solve a lot of problems, Kelvin said. And I could hear him moving around the room, probably pacing the way he did when he got excited about something. I mean, I know it sounds terrible, but think about it. If she died before the wedding, I wouldn't have to deal with her trying to control everything, and I'd inherit whatever money she has left. I've been thinking about this, Kelvin continued, and his voice took on a calculating tone that I'd never heard before. She's got to have at least $1 million saved up. She owned that restaurant for 20 years, plus whatever my grandfather left her. If she died now, I'd get all that money and could plan the wedding I actually want, not the one she's trying to force on me. I felt like I was going to be sick. He had calculated my worth. He had thought about my death and decided it would be profitable. God, Sarah, I know how awful this sounds, Kelvin said. But he didn't sound sorry at all. But honestly, I hope she dies before the wedding so I don't have to deal with her anymore. Then I'd get the inheritance too, and could plan the wedding I actually want. There it was. The words that would replay in my head for the rest of my life. My beloved grandson, the boy I'd raised from a baby when Michael and Karen both had to work, the child I'd spoiled and loved and supported through everything, was literally wishing for my death. She thinks she's helping, Kelvin continued. But she's just making everything harder. I can't wait until this wedding is over and I don't have to pretend to care about her opinions anymore. The thing is, Kelvin said, and I could hear him settling into a chair. She's so naive about business stuff. She thinks because she ran some little restaurant in the middle of nowhere, she understands contracts and vendor relationships. But she doesn't realize that once you sign with vendors, you're locked in. She can't back out now without losing all the deposits. Plus, Kelvin added, she's too sweet to ever actually follow through on any threats. She's one of those people who just wants everyone to be happy. She'd never do anything to hurt me, even if I hurt her first. I stood there in his kitchen, holding on to the counter for support, realizing that my grandson had not only wished for my death, but had also completely underestimated who I was and what I was capable of. You know what the funniest part is? Kelvin said, and his voice was getting louder with excitement. She signed all the contracts as the primary client because she wanted to take care of everything for me. But she doesn't understand that now she's legally responsible for all the payments. Even if she wanted to back out, she'd lose thousands of dollars in deposits. She's trapped. Sarah must have said something encouraging because Kelvin laughed triumphantly. Exactly. She made herself the perfect victim. She's paying for everything. She has no legal way to get out of it. And I can treat her however I want because what's she going to do? Cancel her precious grandson's wedding. She loves me too much to ever do that. I quietly put the wedding favor samples on his kitchen counter and wrote a quick note. Had an emergency. We'll talk later. Love, Grandma. Then I left, closing the door as softly as I could behind me. As I walked to my car, I kept thinking about what Kelvin had said. He thought I was trapped. He thought I was too sweet, too naive, too desperate for his love to ever stand up for myself. He was about to learn how wrong he was about his grandmother. I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I kept hearing Kelvin's voice in my head. I hope she dies before the wedding. Those words played on repeat as I pulled into my driveway and sat in my car for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally made it inside my house, I went straight to my bedroom and collapsed on the bed. I cried harder than I had since Harold died. This wasn't just about the money or the wedding planning. This was about discovering that someone I loved more than life itself actually wished I was dead. I spent the entire evening in that bedroom, going through every memory I had with Kelvin, teaching him to bake cookies when he was 5, helping him with homework throughout elementary school, being there for every birthday, every school play, every important moment in his life, taking care of him when he was sick, supporting him through his first heartbreak, celebrating when he got his job. And through it all, I kept hearing his voice. She's so naive about business stuff. She thinks because she ran some little restaurant in the middle of nowhere, she understands contracts and vendor relationships. That comment hurt almost as much as the death wish. Kelvin had dismissed 20 years of my business experience like it was nothing. He had no idea what it took to run a restaurant, to manage vendors, to negotiate contracts, to handle the financial pressures of keeping a business alive. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Kelvin laughing about how I was trapped by the contracts I'd signed. He thought I was some helpless old woman who'd gotten herself into a situation she couldn't get out of. The next morning, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the wedding planning binder I'd put together. Months of work, months of excitement, months of believing I was doing something beautiful for someone I loved. But Kelvin saw it all as interference and embarrassment. That's when I remembered something from my restaurant days. I walked to my home office and pulled out my filing cabinet, the same one I'd used for business contracts at Ruth's kitchen. I'd always kept meticulous records, always read every contract carefully, always understood exactly what I was signing. I pulled out every single wedding contract and spread them across my desk. The venue, the catering company, the florist, the photographer, the string quartet, the cake designer, even the limo service. One by one, I read through each contract carefully, paying special attention to the cancellation clauses. What I discovered made me smile for the first time in 24 hours. Every single contract was signed by me as the primary client, not just as a guarantor or financial backer. This meant I wasn't just paying for services someone else had arranged. I was the actual customer, the one with decision-making authority, the one with cancellation rights. Even better, most of the contracts had 30-day cancellation clauses with varying penalty structures. Since the wedding was still 4 weeks away, I was well within the cancellation window for most services. I started doing calculations. I'd already paid $15,000 in deposits to various vendors. If I canceled everything now, I'd lose most of those deposits, but I'd avoid the remaining $85,000 in final payments that were due in the next 2 weeks. $15,000 was a lot of money to lose, but it was better than throwing away another $85,000 on someone who wished I was dead. I picked up the phone and called my attorney, Robert Chen, the same man who'd handled Harold's estate. I'd worked with him during my restaurant years too, so he understood my business background. "Robert, I need some advice about contract cancellation," I said when he answered. "Of course, Ruth, what's the situation?" I explained about the wedding contracts, though I didn't go into detail about what Kelvin had said. I just told him I needed to understand my rights as the primary client on these agreements. "Let me be clear about this," Robert said after I'd outlined the situation. "You signed these contracts as the primary client, not as a guarantor. That means you have every right to cancel these services with appropriate notice. You'll lose your deposits, but you're not legally obligated to continue with services you no longer want. Even though it's for my grandson's wedding." "Yes, Ruth, it doesn't matter who the wedding is for. You're the client. You're the one who contracted for these services. You can cancel them for any reason or no reason at all, as long as you follow the cancellation procedures outlined in each contract." That afternoon, I called my banker, Helen Morrison, who had been handling my accounts since I'd opened the restaurant. I wanted to understand exactly what my financial position was. "Helen, I need to know my exact liquid assets," I said. "I'm considering making some changes to some significant commitments I've made." Helen pulled up my accounts. "Ruth, between your savings, your CDs, and your money market accounts, you have about $450,000 in liquid assets. Plus your house is worth about $300,000, and it's completely paid off. And that doesn't include the inheritance from my sister Elizabeth last month." "Oh, that's right. The estate settlement added another $400,000 to your portfolio. I hadn't included that in my initial calculation." I sat back in my chair. I had over $800,000 in liquid assets plus a paid-off house. Kelvin had guessed I had at least $1 million. And he wasn't wrong, but he had no idea that I'd recently inherited substantially more than that from my sister. "Helen, if I were to cancel some contracts and lose about $15,000 in deposits, how would that affect my financial position?" "Ruth, $15,000 would be less than 2% of your liquid assets. You'd barely notice it financially speaking." That evening, I sat in my living room with a legal pad and made a list of every vendor. Next to each name, I wrote the deposit amount I'd lose and the final payment amount I'd save by canceling. The math was simple. Lose $15,000, save $85,000, net savings $70,000. But this wasn't really about the money. This was about dignity and self-respect. I'd been in business long enough to know that you don't continue doing business with people who don't respect you. And you certainly don't fund the dreams of people who wish you were dead. I thought about Kelvin's comment that I was too sweet to ever do anything to hurt him. He was right that I didn't want to hurt him, but I also wasn't going to continue financing someone who saw me as an embarrassing burden. I realized that Kelvin had made two crucial mistakes. First, he'd assumed I was too emotionally invested to make a business decision. Second, he'd underestimated my business competence and legal understanding. She made herself the perfect victim, Kelvin had said about me. She's paying for everything. She has no legal way to get out of it, and I can treat her however I want because what's she going to do? But I wasn't a victim. I was a businesswoman who'd run a successful restaurant for 2 decades. I knew how to read contracts, how to manage vendor relationships, and how to make difficult decisions when necessary. The next morning I called Robert again. Robert, I've decided to cancel all the wedding contracts. Can you help me make sure I do this properly? Of course, Ruth. Do you want to tell me what's changed? Let's just say I've learned some things about the people I was trying to help, and I've decided my money would be better spent elsewhere. I understand. Let me review each contract and prepare the cancellation notices. We'll want to send them certified mail to ensure proper documentation. Perfect. And Robert, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not canceling because I'm angry or trying to punish anyone. I'm canceling because I refuse to fund people who don't respect me. That's a very reasonable business decision, Ruth. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I booked a cruise, a 2-week Alaska cruise that I'd always wanted to take, but had never felt I could afford. It would cost exactly $70,000 for the luxury suite I'd always dreamed of. $70,000. The exact amount I'd save by canceling Kelvin's wedding. As I gave the travel agent my credit card information, I realized something important. For the first time in 3 years, I was spending money on myself instead of on people who didn't appreciate me. I was done being the sweet, naive grandmother who could be taken advantage of. I was done funding people who wished I was dead. I was done accepting disrespect in exchange for the privilege of being generous. Kelvin thought he had me figured out. He thought I was trapped, weak, and too loving to ever stand up for myself. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I made myself breakfast, got dressed in my best business suit, and sat down at my desk with the stack of cancellation letters Robert had prepared. I started with the venue. Maple Ridge Country Club had been Kelvin's dream location with its beautiful gardens and elegant ballroom. I called the events coordinator, Mrs. Patterson, whom I'd worked with for months. Mrs. Patterson, this is Ruth Richardson. I need to cancel the wedding reception scheduled for 4 weeks from Saturday. There was a pause. Oh my, Mrs. Richardson, I'm so sorry to hear that. Is everything all right? There have been some family circumstances that have made it necessary to cancel. I understand I'll forfeit my deposit. Yes. Unfortunately, the $3,000 deposit is non-refundable at this point, but you won't be responsible for the remaining $12,000 in final payments. That's exactly what I expected. Please send me written confirmation of the cancellation. Next was the catering company. 5-course dinner for 150 guests with the balance of $10,000 due in 10 days. Elegant Events Catering. This is Monica. Monica, this is Ruth Richardson. I need to cancel the catering service for the Richardson-Wilson wedding. Oh no. I'm so sorry to hear that, Mrs. Richardson. You'll lose your $2,000 deposit, but you won't owe the final payment. I understand. Please send me written confirmation. One by one, I methodically called every vendor. The florist, the photographer, the string quartet, the cake designer, the limo service. Each conversation was professional and brief. Each vendor expressed sympathy and confirmed the same thing. I'd lose my deposit but save thousands in final payments. By noon, I had cancelled $100,000 worth of wedding services. I'd lost $15,000 in deposits, but I'd saved $85,000 in final payments. Then I sat back and waited. The first call came 2 days later. It was Thursday afternoon, and I was in my garden when my phone rang. "Grandma," Kelvin's voice was shaky. "I just got the strangest call from Maple Ridge Country Club. They said you canceled the reception venue. But that can't be right, can it? There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake, Kelvin," I said calmly. "I canceled all the wedding vendors yesterday." "What? But why? What happened?" "I heard your conversation with Sarah on Tuesday. The one where you said you hoped I would die before the wedding so you could get my inheritance and plan the wedding you actually wanted." The silence on the other end was deafening. "Grandma, I was just stressed. I didn't mean." "You calculated my net worth, Kelvin. You said I was naive about business and that I was trapped by the contracts I'd signed. You called me an embarrassing burden and said you couldn't wait to stop pretending to care about my opinions. I was just venting. I didn't mean any of it. You meant every word and you were wrong about something important. I'm not trapped by those contracts. I was the primary client, which means I had every right to cancel them. And I'm not naive about business. I spent 20 years successfully running a restaurant. But Grandma, the wedding is in 3 weeks. What am I supposed to do?" "That's not my problem to solve anymore, Kelvin. You wanted to plan your own wedding without my interference. Now you can." The phone calls from the family started within hours. First Michael called, then Karen, then Brad. Each conversation was variations of the same theme: disbelief, anger, and desperate attempts to get me to change my mind. "Mom, you can't do this to Kelvin," Michael said. "He's your grandson. He made a mistake, but he's young. He's 24 years old, Michael. He's old enough to understand that wishing someone dead while spending their money has consequences. But he didn't mean it literally. He calculated my inheritance value and said he hoped I would die so he could get the money and plan a different wedding. How exactly am I supposed to interpret that?" Karen called next, crying. "Ruth, please, you have to understand. Kelvin is just overwhelmed with wedding planning. He loves you so much. If he loves me, he has a strange way of showing it. He removed my friends from the guest list, excluded me from vendor meetings, and dismissed every suggestion I made, all while I was paying for everything. We'll pay you back. We'll find a way to cover the costs." "With what money, Karen? You couldn't afford this wedding before I offered to pay for it." "Nothing has changed except that Kelvin showed me his true feelings." Brad called too. The poor young man. "Mrs. Richardson. I'm so sorry about what Kelvin said. He was just stressed and he didn't mean any of it. Please, isn't there some way we can work this out?" I almost felt sorry for him. He seemed genuinely shocked by what Kelvin had said. "Brad, I'm not angry with you, but I'm not going to continue funding someone who wishes I was dead. Kelvin is free to plan whatever wedding he can afford on his own." The most dramatic call came from Kelvin himself the next day. He was sobbing hysterically. "Grandma, I called all the vendors. They want $85,000 to reinstate the services. We don't have that kind of money. You know we don't have that kind of money." "I know exactly what you can afford, Kelvin. You were planning a $5,000 wedding before I offered to help. You can still have that wedding. But all my friends are expecting this beautiful wedding. The invitations are already sent. Everyone knows it's going to be at Maple Ridge. Then you'll have to explain to your friends why the plans changed. Perhaps you can tell them that you wished your grandmother was dead and she decided not to fund your dream wedding anymore." "I didn't mean it. I was just frustrated." "Kelvin, you didn't just say you were frustrated. You said you hoped I would die. You calculated how much money you'd inherit. You called me naive and said I was trapped. Those weren't words spoken in frustration. Those were your true feelings. Please, Grandma, I'll apologize. I'll do anything. Just please don't ruin my wedding. I'm not ruining your wedding, Kelvin. I'm simply not paying for it anymore. You can still get married. You just can't do it on my dime while wishing I was dead. The calls continued for several days. Michael suggested family counseling. Karen offered to have Kelvin write me a letter of apology. Brad's parents even called to offer to mediate. But I was done. I'd made my decision based on business principles that had served me well for decades. You don't continue doing business with people who don't respect you. 2 weeks later, I received a wedding invitation in the mail. Kelvin and Brad were getting married at the local community center with a reception in the fellowship hall. The invitation was printed on simple cardstock, nothing like the elegant letterpress invitations that had been ordered for the original wedding. I didn't attend. Instead, I was on a cruise ship in Alaska, watching glaciers from the deck of my luxury suite. I'd used the money I'd saved from canceling Kelvin's wedding to give myself the trip of a lifetime. The cruise was everything I dreamed it would be. I made new friends, saw incredible sights, and enjoyed the kind of luxury I'd never allowed myself before. For the first time in years, I was spending money on someone who appreciated it, myself. When I returned home, I found a thank you card from Kelvin in my mailbox. It was a simple card with a photo from his wedding. He and Brad looked happy, standing in front of a simple backdrop in the community center. Inside he'd written, "Dear Grandma, thank you for everything you taught me about respect and consequences. I understand now why you made the decision you did. I hope someday I can earn back your trust and your love. Love, Kelvin." I kept the card, but I didn't call him. Some lessons take time to fully sink in, and I wanted to make sure Kelvin truly understood what he'd lost before I considered rebuilding our relationship. 3 months later, I updated my will. Kelvin's inheritance went to several charities instead. I also established a scholarship fund for young women starting their own businesses using the money I'd originally planned to leave to someone who had wished I was dead. I learned something important during this whole experience. It's never too late to demand respect. At 71 years old, I discovered that I still had the power to make choices that honored my own dignity and self-worth. Kelvin got married, just not the wedding he'd planned, and I got something more valuable than any wedding could have provided. I got my self-respect back. Sometimes love means saying no. Sometimes generosity means stopping the flow of money to people who don't appreciate it. And sometimes the best gift you can give someone is to let them experience the consequences of their own choices. My money, my choice, my dignity was worth more than any wedding. And I sleep peacefully knowing that I don't fund people who wish me dead. So that's my story. I'd love to hear what you think. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision to protect your own dignity, even when it meant disappointing someone you loved? Let me know in the comments and subscribe if you want to hear more stories like mine.